On January 5, 1942, as Tokyo filled with triumphant celebration, one man aboard the battleship Yamato was already planning how Japan might lose the war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, studied the map in front of him and quietly ordered his staff to prepare the second phase of operations in the Pacific. Japan's victories in the opening month of the war had stunned the world. Pearl Harbor lay burning. Britain's Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk in a single afternoon. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies were collapsing one by one. Across the Western Pacific, Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. But Yamamoto had lived in the United States. He had studied American industry, American optimism, American stubbornness. And he knew something many in Tokyo refused to accept. Japan could win every battle for 6 months and still lose the war completely. His warning to his staff was blunt. If we cannot force a settlement within the first year, we will be at a severe disadvantage afterward. He believed Japan had a brief window, 18 months at most, to achieve a decisive victory or force a negotiated peace before American production surged beyond anything Japan could match. Inside the Imperial General Staff, the split was obvious. Hardline nationalists wanted to push farther into Australia, India, perhaps even the Middle East. They believed Japan's destiny was to seize everything it could as long as troops kept winning. Yamamoto, on the other hand, understood the limits of Japan's economy and the vulnerability of its supply lines. He feared the overexpansion that the army so enthusiastically sought. Even Pearl Harbor, brilliant as the attack had been, had failed in a critical way. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, and others, had not been in port. They remained a threat, mobile and lethal. Yamamoto knew they had to be destroyed. By early 1942, Japan needed another shock, another overwhelming victory to break American morale before it fully recovered. The question was, where to strike next? The army rejected Yamamoto's proposal to attack the Soviet Union. They were bogged down in China and Southeast Asia and had no desire to start a second land war against a massive continental power. Instead, planners debated a strike toward India, a push into the South Pacific toward Australia, or a bold attempt to lure the American carrier fleet into a decisive battle. Yamamoto favored a dramatic advance into the Indian Ocean, destroying the British Eastern Fleet, isolating India, and linking up with German forces pushing toward the Caucasus. But the army dismissed the plan as unrealistic. The next major proposal was an invasion of Australia, seizing New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Tokyo even began outlining occupation structures for Australia and New Zealand. But Yamamoto opposed the idea. The distances were vast, the logistics overwhelming, and the payoff uncertain. He also believed the Americans, enraged by Pearl Harbor, would never quit simply because Australia fell. What Yamamoto wanted was a decisive victory, a single battle so catastrophic to American naval power that Washington would be forced to negotiate. Throughout February and March, he quietly developed the operation that would become the Battle of Midway, intending to capture the island, force the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond, and then ambush and annihilate the American carriers. But the idea grew even larger. Alongside Midway, Yamamoto proposed the AL operation, a strike into Alaska's Aleutian Islands, and ultimately, if everything went perfectly, the possible occupation of Hawaii or even the American West Coast. These ambitions were unlikely, but to Yamamoto they were bargaining chips for a future peace. The Japanese High Command approved his plan. What none of them knew was that an event in April would change everything: the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo itself. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's leadership was humiliated. If American carriers could appear off Japan's coast once, they could do it again. Yamamoto's Midway Plan, originally intended as a strategic blow, now became an urgent necessity. He had to destroy the U.S. carriers immediately. As Japan prepared its trap at Midway, another front was forming in the South Pacific. Japanese forces had captured Rabaul and begun expanding their reach toward New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Airfields were being built, supply lines extended, and reconnaissance increased. The Japanese intended to isolate Australia and cut the Allied line of communication across the Pacific. What none of them expected was that the United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, was about to launch its first major offensive of the Pacific War at a place few Americans had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. By mid-1942, Japan's expansion across the Pacific seemed unstoppable. Rabaul had become a massive forward base, New Guinea was under attack, and Japanese bombers were striking Australia. Across the Solomon Islands, construction units were preparing new positions for the next stage of operations. Allied intelligence realized what this meant. If Japan secured New Guinea and cut the supply line from the United States to Australia, the entire Allied position in the Pacific could collapse. General Douglas MacArthur urgently warned that the Japanese were preparing an offensive toward Port Moresby, a move that could open the path to northern Australia. He asked Washington for carriers and aircraft. Washington simply didn't have them. The U.S. Navy had 2 operational carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 10. Yet Admirals Nimitz and King agreed on one thing. The United States had to seize the initiative somewhere before Japan locked in its gains. Then came the turning point. Allied coast watchers reported Japanese activity on an obscure island called Guadalcanal. Japanese engineers were clearing land, burning grass, and stacking supplies on a long, flat stretch of terrain, perfect for an airfield. U.S. cryptanalysts confirmed it. Japanese construction units, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, were scheduled to arrive on July 4th. An airfield on Guadalcanal could dominate sea lanes, threaten Allied convoys, and isolate Australia. Admiral Turner understood instantly. The airfield could not be allowed to fall. Within days, the United States committed to its first major amphibious offensive of the Pacific War. The operation had almost no preparation. Troops were loaded with supplies thrown onto transports in random order. Amphibious doctrine barely existed. Many Marines had never landed on a hostile beach. The rehearsal on Coral Island was so chaotic that only 1/3 of the assault troops reached shore. There was no time to fix anything. The order from Admiral King was blunt. Proceed as planned. The invasion force set sail. On July 31, 1942, more than 75 Allied ships headed toward the Solomons. The carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and thousands of Marines of the 1st Marine Division under General Alexander Vandegrift. Weather worked in their favor. Tropical storms and thick cloud cover hid them from Japanese scouts. The Japanese focus remained on New Guinea. Not a single senior commander in Tokyo or Rabaul believed the Americans capable of a major offensive. Reconnaissance flights were limited. Overconfidence was high. At dawn on August 7th, the skies cleared. At 5:30 a.m., the U.S. fleet went to general quarters. At 6 a.m., American carrier aircraft roared toward their targets, Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo, and the airfield under construction at Lunga Point. The Japanese were completely unprepared. The first American offensive of the Pacific War begins. American fighters found no enemy aircraft. Bombers struck fuel dump seaplanes and scattered Japanese positions. 9 Japanese seaplanes were destroyed in the water. Others never made it into the air. Fire spread across the shoreline as U.S. cruisers and destroyers shelled coastal defenses. At 9 a.m., landing craft began moving toward the beaches. The Marines hitting the shore at Guadalcanal were astonished by the lack of resistance. The Japanese construction crews were labor units, not combat troops. Many had fled inland during the bombardment. On the beaches, Marines found abandoned tents, cooking fires, half-eaten meals, and equipment left behind in panic. But this easy landing would soon prove misleading. Across the narrow channel on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the story was very different. Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, the elite of Japan's island garrisons, fought with ferocity. Marines advancing through dense jungle and fortified ridges were met with snipers, interlocking machine gun fire, and suicide charges. Dug-in Japanese defenders fought from caves, tunnels, and rocky hillsides. Every position had to be taken by grenades, dynamite, or hand-to-hand combat. Surrender was almost non-existent. By the end of August 8th, the Marines had secured Tulagi and the surrounding islands, but at significant cost. The contrast was sharp. Guadalcanal seemed almost empty, while the nearby islands had become scenes of brutal, close-quarters combat. What the Americans did not yet realize was that the true test of their invasion, the struggle that would define the early Pacific War, was about to begin. By the evening of August 8, 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal seemed almost too easy. American forces had taken the unfinished airfield with minimal resistance. Supplies were flowing ashore in massive disorganized piles. Marines roasted captured Japanese food, explored abandoned camps, and joked about how quickly the enemy had disappeared into the jungle. But officers were uneasy. Something about the silence felt wrong. Meanwhile, across the channel, the Japanese response was gathering speed. The moment Tulagi sent its frantic distress signal, "Enemy bombardment in progress," messages raced through the Japanese command network. Rabaul's airfields scrambled to prepare bombers. The 8th Fleet under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa reacted immediately. He ordered reinforcements toward Guadalcanal, but one of the transports was sunk by a U.S. submarine. Realizing the American invasion force was enormous, Mikawa recalled the remaining transports and instead turned to the one thing he knew could strike quickly: his cruisers. At that moment, Mikawa had a powerful surface force available: 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, a destroyer escort, all positioned near Rabaul, refueled, armed, and ready. Just hours after the first American landings, Mikawa boarded his flagship and steamed south. His mission: attack the Allied invasion fleet at night and destroy as many transports and warships as possible. If he succeeded, the Marines on Guadalcanal would be stranded. The Americans failed to see the threat. Incredibly, Allied reconnaissance failed to detect Mikawa's approach. The search plans for August 8th left a huge gap directly along the obvious Japanese route toward Guadalcanal. Miscommunications between Admiral Turner, Admiral McCain, and seaplane units resulted in the slot going unpatrolled. Even when U.S. Army B-17s sighted Japanese ships earlier in the day, the reports were discounted. Rabaul was active every day. No one assumed these cruisers were headed directly for the landing beaches. Despite having dozens of ships, dozens of aircraft, and multiple intelligence channels, the Americans never formed a clear picture of the approaching danger. Mikawa, however, knew exactly what he intended to do. He slowed his force during daylight to avoid detection and timed his arrival for after midnight, when the Americans would least expect him. Japanese night tactics were honed through years of training. Their lookouts were exceptional, their torpedoes the deadliest in the world, and their cruisers drilled relentlessly for nighttime attack. The Americans, in contrast, were inexperienced in night fighting. Their ships were scattered, their commanders were exhausted, and their carriers, under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, were preparing to leave. Admiral Fletcher withdraws the carriers. Throughout August 7th and 8th, American fighters engaged repeated waves of Japanese bombers flying from Rabaul. Although they destroyed many attackers, they lost dozens of fighters in the process. Fletcher, worried about his air losses and the risk of Japanese land-based air power, sent a request to withdraw his carriers. Before Admiral Gormley even replied, Fletcher made his decision. On the evening of August 8th, while the Marines still depended entirely on carrier air cover, Fletcher took Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp and began retreating south. Admiral Turner was stunned when he received the message. He knew the consequences immediately. Without the carriers, the invasion force was exposed. Transports and supply ships were still unloading. Marines on shore had no functioning airfield yet. Anti-aircraft defenses were limited, but it was too late. Fletcher was gone. Mikawa's cruisers, meanwhile, were racing south at high speed. The Japanese strike at night. Shortly before midnight on August 8th, Mikawa's force entered the channel north of Guadalcanal, later known as Iron Bottom Sound. They approached undetected. The Allied picket destroyers were poorly positioned. The American and Australian cruisers guarding the transport area had no unified radar picture, no coordinated command, and no expectation of an attack. At 1:43 a.m. on August 9th, lookouts aboard the Japanese cruiser Chokai spotted silhouettes of Allied ships against the faint glow of the horizon. Mikawa ordered the attack. What followed was one of the most devastating night battles in U.S. naval history. Japanese cruisers unleashed a torrent of gunfire and Type 93 long lance torpedoes, deadly weapons with unmatched range and explosive power. The Allied force, confused and caught off guard, struggled to respond. Some cruisers fired blindly. Others never got the chance. Within minutes, the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was hit repeatedly and left burning. The U.S. cruiser USS Chicago was torpedoed. USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, and USS Astoria, 3 New Orleans-class cruisers, were struck by multiple torpedoes and shells erupting in flames. One by one, they sank. But their destruction didn't change the strategic reality. A powerful Japanese surface force was now racing down the slot, and the Americans had no idea it was coming. As night fell on August 8th, the beaches of Guadalcanal were still crowded with supplies that had barely been moved inland. Trucks were not yet organized. Marines were exhausted from 2 days of continuous fighting, and the command posts were only beginning to establish proper defensive lines. The Japanese, meanwhile, had perfected night fighting doctrine over years of war in China. Their crews trained constantly at night, memorizing firing solutions and torpedo tactics in conditions the Americans barely practiced. At 8:55 p.m., Admiral Turner sent a message to Admiral Fletcher, asking him to remain nearby for another day. Fletcher, already retreating, never saw it. By the time the message reached him, he was more than 100 miles away and still increasing distance. For the first time in the Pacific War, a major American amphibious force would face a night attack without carrier air cover. Around 10:20 p.m., the Allied screening force, cruisers and destroyers from the U.S. and Australia, patrolled the waters north of Savo Island. Their job was clear: prevent any Japanese ships from entering the channel between Guadalcanal and Florida Island. But they were exhausted. The radar systems on the cruisers were primitive, especially compared to the long-range air search radars the Americans would later deploy. Lookouts strained their eyes in darkness made worse by pre-dawn haze. The commanders, unsure of Japanese intentions, relaxed their readiness posture slightly after midnight. It was a mistake. At 12:40 a.m., lookouts aboard the Japanese cruiser Chokai spotted the silhouettes of Allied ships. Admiral Mikawa immediately prepared his formation for attack. His cruisers fanned out into a perfect torpedo launching line. At ranges between 3,000 and 5,000 yards, point blank for the deadly Type 93 long lance torpedo, the Japanese launched dozens of weapons, each capable of ripping a heavy cruiser in half. At 1:43 a.m., the Allied picket destroyer USS Blue spotted a suspicious shape, but reported it too late. The Japanese force was already inside the perimeter. At 1:44, the long lances struck. The HMAS Canberra, pride of the Australian Navy, was hit first. 2 torpedoes ripped into her port side. A second later, Japanese shells smashed her superstructure. Within minutes, the ship lost power, listed sharply, and was dead in the water. Aboard the bridge, officers attempted to restore communications while ammunition cooked off in the heat of spreading fires. The Japanese gunners shifted targets with astonishing discipline, training their guns next on the American cruiser USS Chicago. One torpedo struck her bow, blowing open the forward compartments and killing dozens instantly. She survived but was crippled. Then came the hammer blow. On the northern side of Savo Island, the cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, and USS Astoria steamed unknowingly into the kill zone. Japanese spotters saw their outlines perfectly lit by fire from Canberra. At 1:50 a.m., dozens of long lances were in the water, streaking toward the unaware Americans. At 1:55, the first torpedo slammed into Quincy. Within seconds, two more struck. Shellfire tore through her midsection. Quincy's captain, Samuel Moore, was mortally wounded as the bridge erupted in flames. The ship sank stern first in less than 40 minutes. Vincent fared no better. Shot after shot crashed into her hull. Her forward magazines detonated, sending smoke and debris hundreds of feet into the air. At 2:03 a.m., she capsized, taking more than 300 men with her. Astoria, fighting desperately, managed to return fire, but it was too late. She was hit repeatedly, set ablaze, and left adrift. She would sink hours later despite frantic damage control efforts. The Battle of Savo Island would be remembered as the worst defeat in U.S. naval history, worse even than Pearl Harbor in terms of lost cruisers. Within an hour, 4 heavy cruisers were sunk, another damaged, and more than 1,000 sailors killed. And the Japanese. They slipped back up the slot, virtually untouched. Admiral Mikawa had achieved total surprise. He had the option to proceed south and destroy the American transports lying defenseless off Guadalcanal, an action that might have altered the entire course of the campaign. But cautious of daylight air attack, he withdrew immediately, leaving the American beachhead intact. The Marines on Guadalcanal slept through most of the battle, unaware that disaster had unfolded just miles offshore. At dawn, they surveyed the horizon and saw only oil slicks, debris, and the rising smoke of burning ships. But the beachhead still held. Against all odds, the Guadalcanal campaign would continue. The wreckage still smoldered on the morning of August 9th. Oil slicks drifted across the calm water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. Marines who had fallen asleep thinking the Navy protected them now woke to unsettling silence. No cruisers offshore, no destroyers on patrol. Only columns of black smoke rising over the horizon revealed the magnitude of the disaster. General Alexander Vandegrift quickly understood the implications. His division was alone. Admiral Fletcher had withdrawn the carriers. The screening cruisers had been sunk in the night. There would be no long-range air cover, no naval gunfire support, and no certainty that supplies would keep coming. Worse, the Japanese were certain to counterattack. Admiral Turner attempted to salvage the situation by ordering transports to unload as fast as possible. But confusion jammed the beaches. Supplies lay scattered, crates of ammunition, medical kits, fuel drums, engineering tools, food, all piled with no system. Bulldozers were scarce, trucks few, and most Marines were either digging defenses or collapsing from exhaustion. Turner knew the transports were vulnerable. Japanese bombers would surely return. But without air cover, there was no alternative. By mid-afternoon, Turner made the painful decision. All transports would withdraw. The Marines were left with only a portion of their intended supplies, limited ammunition, short rations, minimal equipment, and Henderson Field still incomplete. The situation was precarious. In Rabaul, the Japanese reaction was immediate. The loss of Guadalcanal, especially its airfield, was unacceptable. Henderson Field threatened supply lines, troop movements, and the entire New Guinea campaign. Japanese commanders concluded the island must be retaken at any cost. On August 12th, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite detachment departed Truk aboard destroyers. Ichiki, known for his aggressiveness, dismissed American strength and believed he needed only 900 men to sweep the enemy into the sea. His confidence would prove fatal. Meanwhile, the Marines fortified their perimeter. Defensive lines took shape around Henderson Field. Foxholes, machine gun positions, and barbed wire were placed along likely approaches. The Seabees worked non-stop to repair the airstrip. Malaria spread, food was limited, and water scarce, but morale held. If the airfield became operational, the balance of power might shift. On August 12th, hope arrived. 3 SBD dive bombers and 1 TBF Avenger appeared overhead, the first aircraft of what would soon be called the Cactus Air Force. Their landing electrified the Marines. Air cover meant survival, but Japanese reinforcements were already coming. The Tokyo Express, fast destroyers carrying troops, began racing down the slot at night. They delivered men, supplies, and artillery under darkness, then escaped before dawn. On August 18th, Ichiki's detachment reached Taivu Point. Instead of waiting for the rest of his regiment, Ichiki marched immediately toward the Marine perimeter. He planned a night attack that would break American lines in a single blow. Shortly after midnight on August 21st, he launched his assault across the sandbar at the Ilu River, the battle later known as Tanaru. His men charged in tight formations, shouting "Banzai" as they ran into Marine machine gun fire. The Marines, entrenched behind barbed wire, unleashed devastating crossfire. Dozens fell in seconds. Ichiki insisted on more attacks. They failed. By dawn, Marines counterattacked along the beach with mortars, machine guns, and light tanks. The Japanese line collapsed. Of Ichiki's 900 men, fewer than 100 survived. Ichiki, disgraced, burned his flag and committed suicide. The message was unmistakable. The Americans were not leaving Guadalcanal. Japan now realized the island would require far larger forces. The campaign had entered a new and brutal phase. At one point, Japanese troops penetrated the Marine line, but a counterattack, supported by tanks and point-blank artillery, sealed the breach. When dawn broke, hundreds of Japanese bodies lay scattered along the muddy perimeter. Maruyama's assault had failed. The Japanese Navy, determined to break the stalemate, prepared a massive bombardment. On the night of October 15th, 2 battleships, Kongo and Haruna, approached Guadalcanal undetected. For over an hour, they pounded Henderson Field with 14-inch shells, flattening hangars, destroying aircraft and igniting supply dumps. It was the heaviest bombardment the airfield would face. By morning, Henderson Field was nearly destroyed. Only a handful of aircraft remained. The Japanese believed they had finally neutralized American air power. But again, the Marines and Seabees defied expectation. Working non-stop through the day, they patched the runway with crushed coral, dragged shattered aircraft aside, and repaired what little remained. By afternoon, the airfield was operational enough for a single squadron to take flight. It was not much, but it was enough. Japan's window to strike was shrinking. American reinforcements were approaching, transports, escort carriers, and battleships. The Imperial Japanese Navy prepared to intercept them in a decisive battle, one that both sides believed could determine control of the entire Pacific. The stage was set for what historians would later call the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a multi-day clash involving dozens of ships, thousands of sailors, and some of the most savage night fighting ever recorded. The outcome would decide not just the fate of the island, but the future of the entire Pacific War. One by one, they sank beneath the surface, leaving only scattered debris drifting in the moonlit water. By the time the final cruiser disappeared into the dark, the Battle of Savo Island had become one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. In just a few minutes, the Japanese had wiped out 4 heavy cruisers, severely damaged another, and killed more than 1,000 Allied sailors, all without losing a single ship of their own. At dawn on August 9th, the survivors still clinging to debris saw the scale of the disaster. Oil fires drifted across the sea like floating shadows. Life rafts were overcrowded. Many men were burned, wounded, or covered in fuel. And still, the Japanese force was already miles away, having withdrawn cleanly before daylight exposed them to American air power. News of the disaster reached Admiral Turner and General Vandegrift as they were still unloading supplies on Guadalcanal. The loss of the cruisers meant the beaches and supply lines were now dangerously exposed. Worse yet, Admiral Fletcher had already withdrawn the carriers the previous evening, leaving the Marines without air cover. Turner now faced an impossible choice: continue unloading slowly and risk annihilation from Japanese air attacks, or pull out and leave the Marines with only whatever supplies they already had ashore. He chose to withdraw. The transports pulled away from the beaches on the night of August 9th, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal with far less than planned. Only a fraction of the ammunition, food, fuel, and engineering equipment they were supposed to have. Many units had only a few days of rations. Heavy gear like radios, spare machine guns, and barbed wire had never been unloaded. The Marines now faced the Japanese, alone. Still, the men moved quickly to secure the newly captured airfield. They finished what the Japanese had started, repairing the runway and placing defenses around its perimeter. They would soon rename it Henderson Field. It was the key to survival. If they could protect it long enough for American planes to land and operate from it, everything could change. While the Marines dug in, the Japanese High Command tried to assess what had happened. Their cruisers had won a stunning victory, but the landing at Guadalcanal still threatened Japanese control of the South Pacific. Tokyo believed the American presence had to be erased immediately. Reinforcements were ordered to gather at Rabaul. The Japanese army planned a counterattack that would crush the Marines before they could establish a foothold. But the Japanese underestimated two things: the determination of the Marines and the importance of the airfield they had seized. Control of Henderson Field would allow the Americans to dominate the surrounding seas during the day, forcing the Japanese to run supplies and reinforcements only at night. These nocturnal runs would later be nicknamed the Tokyo Express. For the moment, though, the Japanese still believed they could overwhelm the Marines with infantry. As the Marines worked on the airfield, they heard distant engines over the water, the first transports bringing Japanese troops down the slot. The fight for Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive of World War II, was about to escalate into one of the most brutal campaigns in the Pacific. This island, barely known a week earlier, would soon become legendary. The outcome here would shape the entire course of the Pacific War. Within days, Japanese reinforcements began pouring into the Solomon Islands. Destroyers raced down the slot each night, unloading troops, ammunition, and heavy weapons before speeding back to safer waters before daylight. The Marines could hear them offshore in the darkness, powerful engines rumbling, the splash of cargo being dumped overboard, and the occasional burst of gunfire echoing through the jungle. By mid-August, the Japanese had concentrated enough forces at Taivu Point to begin probing American lines. Small units crept forward through the thick vegetation, testing defenses and mapping the terrain. It soon became clear that the Japanese were preparing for a major offensive to retake the airfield. The Marines, outnumbered and undersupplied, fortified their positions as best they could. They constructed foxholes, machine gun nests, and makeshift obstacles out of logs and barbed wire, much of it scavenged from abandoned Japanese equipment. Every night, flares lit the sky, and rifle fire crackled from the jungle as both sides pushed patrols toward each other. On August 21st, the first major Japanese attack came at the mouth of the Tenaru River. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite detachment, one of the finest infantry units in the Japanese army, launched a fierce assault, confident they would drive the Marines into the sea. Ichiki's men advanced in rigid formation, shouting battle cries as they charged directly across the sandbar, leading to the American lines. They were met with devastating machine gun fire. Marines of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines held their ground, pouring rifle and automatic weapons fire into the charging Japanese. The attackers attempted to breach the lines again and again, but each time they were pushed back with heavy casualties. When daylight came, the Marines counterattacked, flanking the Japanese positions and trapping Ichiki's men against the beach. By the afternoon, the entire Ichiki detachment had been annihilated. Only a handful of wounded survivors were captured. Colonel Ichiki committed suicide near the sandbar where his men had fallen. For the first time in the war, a major Japanese ground unit had been completely destroyed by American forces, but the Japanese High Command believed the defeat was only a setback. Reinforcements continued to arrive at night, and plans were laid for a much larger assault. Meanwhile, the Americans had begun flying in fighter planes and dive bombers to Henderson Field, turning the airstrip into a formidable base. Every day, U.S. aircraft attacked Japanese shipping, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. The airfield became known as the Cactus Air Force, and its presence forced the Japanese to run supplies only under cover of darkness. Still, the Marines faced shortages of nearly everything: food, medical supplies, spare parts, and ammunition. Malaria spread rapidly, and many units were forced to fight while feverish and exhausted. Japanese artillery shelling from beyond the Lunga perimeter became a daily occurrence. Each night, Japanese destroyers unleashed bombardments against Henderson Field, shaking the ground and throwing debris across the runways. Yet, the Marines held. By late August, the Japanese were preparing a second major offensive, far larger and more coordinated than the Ichiki attack. Thousands of troops moved secretly through the jungle along narrow trails, attempting to approach the American positions undetected. The coming battle would determine whether the Marines could hold Guadalcanal or whether the island would fall back into Japanese hands. The campaign was entering its most dangerous phase. The fate of Henderson Field and the entire South Pacific hung in the balance.